Welcome to Bumpy Johnson Uncensored. Today we're diving into a powerful and rarely told moment from 1946, the day an elderly woman stopped Bumpy Johnson on a Harlem street, and what happened next stunned all of New York. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because the research behind these true historical stories takes a lot of time, digging, verification to bring you real facts, not myths. It was a chilly afternoon in 1946, kind where Harlem's streets were busy but quiet enough for conversations to carry through the air. Bumpy Johnson was standing near the corner of Lenox Avenue and 137th Street, his usual stretch, talking casually with a few local businessmen and neighborhood elders. People knew better than to interrupt him when he was in deep discussion, but that day something unusual happened. From across the street, an elderly woman, small in size, wrapped in a worn-out coat, walking with a noticeable limp, began making her way directly toward Bumpy. First, no one paid attention, but as she got closer, the crowd realized she wasn't just passing by. She was coming straight for him, and that alone was shocking, because most people in Harlem approached Bumpy with caution, respect, or fear. But this woman walked with no hesitation, no fear, no second thoughts. Her hands were shaking, her breathing fast, but her eyes were locked on Bumpy as if she had been searching for him. Bumpy noticed her before anyone else did. His entire conversation paused. His men stepped slightly forward, instinctively creating a barrier, but Bumpy raised a hand. He saw something in her face that made him stop everything. As she reached him, the entire corner fell silent. People watched from stoops, store windows, and street corners, wondering why this vulnerable old woman would walk right up to the most feared and respected man in Harlem. Some whispered that she must have been confused. Others thought she was lost. But the look in her eyes said something different. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She needed Bumpy Johnson for something urgent. What made it even more shocking was that she didn't show an ounce of fear. It was as if she believed Bumpy was the only person who would listen, the only person she could trust. And that confidence alone, coming from a fragile elderly woman, was enough to grab everyone's attention and set the stage for a moment Harlem would never forget. As the elderly woman finally stood before Bumpy Johnson, the tension in the air tightened. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip her coat just to steady herself. Her voice cracked before a word even came out. Bumpy, noticing her struggle, gently nodded for his men to step back. He lowered himself slightly so he could hear her better, showing a surprising softness rarely seen in public. When she finally spoke, her words came out in small bursts, broken, frightened, determined. She told Bumpy that she wasn't there by accident. She had been looking for him. She had asked around Harlem, wandered the blocks for almost an hour, and every person she spoke to told her the same things. If you need help and nobody's listening, find Bumpy. That alone explained why she chose him. She wasn't searching for a police officer. She wasn't looking for a lawyer. She wasn't trying to file a complaint. She came to Bumpy Johnson because, in 1946 Harlem, Bumpy was often the only person who could get justice for people who were ignored, unheard, or mistreated. He had an unofficial reputation, not just as a feared man, but as someone who protected the vulnerable when the system refused to step in. With tears forming in her eyes, she explained that a man, someone dangerous, someone the neighborhood whispered about, had been threatening her. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. He had taken money from her, pushed her around, and warned her that if she told anyone, the consequences would be severe. And she believed him because no one else had helped her. What hit Bumpy hardest was when she said, voice shaking, "You're the only one he's afraid of." Those words silenced the entire block. For a moment, Bumpy just stared at her, processing what she had just revealed. He wasn't used to hearing praise from strangers, especially elderly women. But he understood the deeper truth behind her statement. Harlem's people respected him because he didn't just rule the streets. He understood them, and he protected them. The woman then reached into her pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a crumpled slip of paper, the name of the man who had been tormenting her. She held it out to Bumpy like a last hope, her hand barely steady enough to keep it from falling, and Bumpy took it. Not slowly, not reluctantly. He accepted it with a kind of certainty that told everyone watching that the situation had just changed dramatically. Her reason for choosing him wasn't fear. It was trust. She believed Bumpy Johnson would do something no one else would. Listen. The moment Bumpy Johnson took the slip of paper from the old woman's trembling hand, the street went dead silent, like Harlem itself was holding its breath. Everyone expected Bumpy to explode, to react with the explosive anger he was famous for when someone preyed on the weak. Even his closest men shifted uncomfortably, bracing for a storm. But instead, Bumpy did something nobody anticipated. He stayed completely calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't show a single ounce of rage. He simply folded the paper once, slid it neatly into his coat pocket, and looked the old woman directly in the eyes. His face softened in a way that surprised everyone watching. Bumpy had many expressions, stern, focused, irritated, but this look was different. It was controlled, measured. Almost protective, he asked her, quietly, "How long has this been going on?" The woman's voice trembled as she explained the weeks of harassment, the threats, the intimidation. She told him how she had tried to speak to a local officer only to be brushed off. She told him how the thug stealing from her laughed when she begged him to stop. And she told Bumpy how she had run out of options until people pointed her in his direction. As she spoke, Bumpy didn't interrupt once. He listened, really listened. And that alone stunned the people around him. This was a man who commanded Harlem's streets, who could end conversations with a look. Yet here he was, giving an elderly woman his full undivided attention as if nothing else in the world mattered. One of his lieutenants leaned in slightly and asked if he wanted them to handle it. Bumpy didn't even look at him. He simply raised one hand, signaling silence. That gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. People realized that Bumpy was processing the situation with a level of calculation that made him far more dangerous than if he had exploded in anger. When Bumpy stayed calm, it meant he was thinking several steps ahead. And that meant something serious was about to unfold. The old woman, still shaking, apologized for bothering him. She apologized for causing a scene. She apologized for interrupting his day. Bumpy shook his head. "You did the right thing coming to me." Those words echoed across the block. People exchanged glances, some in shock, some in admiration. Harlem rarely saw this side of him, the side that made even the toughest men lower their eyes in respect. Bumpy did something even more unexpected. He gently placed his hand on the woman's shoulder and said to one of his men, "Get her something warm to drink. She's been walking too long." The crowd watching couldn't believe it. This wasn't the ruthless kingpin image the newspapers painted. This wasn't the violent man outsiders feared. This was Bumpy Johnson, the man Harlem trusted. And it was in that moment, as he stood calmly in the center of the street with the whole neighborhood watching, the story began to spread. People whispered, people pointed, people said, "Bumpy's about to take care of something big," and they were right. When Bumpy finally unfolded the scrap of paper in his coat pocket, the name written on it made his expression change, just slightly, but enough for his men to notice. Bumpy Johnson was not easy to surprise. He had seen every type of hustler, extortionist, and street predator Harlem could produce. But this name, this one was different. The man harassing the elderly woman wasn't some random street tough. He wasn't a kid looking for quick cash. He wasn't a drunk causing trouble. It was someone with a reputation almost as cold as Harlem in winter, a lone shark named Freddie Knuckles. Marlowe, a man known for preying specifically on the elderly, widows, and immigrants. He targeted the people who had the least ability to fight back. And worse, Freddie had connections with corrupt officers who ignored his violence in exchange for kickbacks. Was the part that angered Bumpy the most. Not the man. Bumpy had dealt with men like that all his life. The fact that this predator operated freely because he hid behind the badge of corrupted protection. As Bumpy read the name silently, a few people nearby gasped. Word spread fast. Harlem always knew who the real villains were. Freddie Marlowe had hurt dozens of people, yet no one ever stood up to him because he wasn't just a bully, he was protected. Untouchable in the eyes of the law, but not in the eyes of Bumpy Johnson. The elderly woman confirmed it a moment later, her voice almost breaking as she explained. "He said he'd break my door down if I didn't pay him again, and that nobody would stop him." That sentence sealed the moment. Bumpy's jaw tightened ever so slightly. His calm expression remained, but his eyes changed, becoming sharper, colder, focused. It was the look that told his men everything they needed to know. This wasn't just a simple street matter. This was personal now, because Freddie had threatened an old woman, but because he had done it believing Bumpy wouldn't intervene. That was the mistake. Bumpy understood Harlem's unspoken rule. You don't touch the elderly. You don't terrorize widows. You don't prey on the vulnerable. Anyone who broke those rules invited consequences that didn't come with warnings. A few men nearby whispered to each other, "Freddie crossed the wrong line this time." Bumpy's not going to ignore this. Freddie's finished. People could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't loud, violent, or chaotic. It was quiet, quiet in the way a storm becomes still right before it hits. Bumpy folded the paper again, tucking it back into his coat with a sense of purpose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply said, "I know who he is. I'll handle it." And that was all Harlem needed to hear. Because when Bumpy Johnson said he would handle something, it meant only one thing. The problem was already over. After assuring the elderly woman he would take care of the situation, Bumpy Johnson didn't rush off in anger or send his men blindly into the streets. That wasn't his style. Bumpy's real power was never just muscle. It was intelligence, precision, and strategy. He started by stepping away from the crowd with two trusted men, Junie Bird and Nat Pettigrew, both known for their loyalty and sharp instincts. Bumpy didn't need a full army for this. He only needed two sets of eyes he trusted more than anyone else. He asked a simple questions. "Where's Freddie been operating lately?" Responded immediately. Junie added details Bumpy already suspected. But that wasn't enough for Bumpy. He wanted confirmation, patterns, exact movements, witness accounts. So he walked down Lenox Avenue, not in a hurry, but with purpose, stopping to speak quietly with street vendors, barbers, doormen, and corner watchers. These weren't informants in the usual sense. They were ordinary Harlem residents who respected Bumpy enough to speak honestly. And they all said the same thing. Freddie had been shaking down vulnerable people for weeks. He had grown bolder. He believed no one could stop him. Bumpy listened without interrupting, asking only short, targeted questions. Who did he threaten last? What time does he usually make his rounds? Who protects him? Where does he collect? Each answer painted a clearer picture. Bumpy approached a small corner store near 139th Street, where the owner, a quiet middle-aged man named Mr. Mendel, was known to witness everything without ever lifting his eyes from the register. Bumpy didn't intimidate him. He simply nodded, offered a respectful greeting, and asked it. "You seen Freddie lately?" Mr. Mendel hesitated for only a moment before, quietly sliding a piece of paper across the counter. It listed Freddie's usual collection times, the buildings he targeted, and even the apartment numbers of people he extorted. Bumpy thanked him with a nod, folded the paper, and slipped it into his pocket like it was a sacred document. He then turned to Junie and Nate. "We're not hitting him blind. We're hitting him smart." That sentence defined everything that followed. Because Bumpy understood something that Freddie didn't. Raw intimidation can control a block, but real power comes from knowing the block better than anyone else. By the time Bumpy finished gathering information, he knew where Freddie slept, who he owed money to, which officers were protecting him, which buildings he extorted, the exact time he made his rounds, and who his next target would be. He knew Freddie's world better than Freddie himself. And with that knowledge, Bumpy didn't need to send a warning. He didn't need to issue a threat. He simply prepared to show up at the perfect moment. The moment Freddie least expected. The moment when the scales of Harlem justice would finally balance. By the time dusk rolled across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson already knew exactly where Freddie Marlowe would be. Freddie operated like clockwork, same route, same victims, same false confidence. He always started on 138th Street around 7 p.m., moving building to building with a smug stride. His coat collar popped high, thinking he owned the block. But on this night, the block wasn't his. The streetlights flickered on as Freddie stepped out of a brownstone, pocketing cash he had just bullied from an elderly tailor. He didn't even bother hiding it, laughing, boasting loudly to one of his cronies about easy money. And how nobody would dare stop him. He was wrong, because at that very moment, a long black Packard pulled up quietly at the end of the street. No screeching tires, no loud engine. Just a slow, smooth stop. The doors opened quietly, and Bumpy Johnson stepped out, coat buttoned, hat low, expression unreadable. The crowd reacted immediately. Whispers rippled through the block. People peeked through windows. Kids froze on the sidewalks. Even the wind seemed to pause. Everyone knew what Bumpy's presence meant. Freddie didn't notice him at first, until his own man tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Boss, that's Bumpy." Freddie froze mid-step. He turned slowly. When he saw Bumpy standing calmly in the center of the street, his confidence evaporated. That loud mouth of his suddenly went silent. He swallowed hard. His hands twitched. He looked around for cops he thought would protect him, but none were in sight, because even corrupt officers knew not to step between Bumpy and justice in Harlem. Bumpy didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't rush. He simply walked toward Freddie with slow, controlled steps, the kind that made a man feel the weight of every second. When he stopped barely 3 feet away, the entire block felt the tension tighten like a drum. Bumpy spoke first, his voice calm and low. "You been bothering old folks, huh?" Freddie tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. It's just business, Bumpy." Bumpy's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but disappointment. "You don't do business with the elderly. That's a rule." The street went silent. Freddie's right-hand man tried to step forward, but Bumpy's men moved in instantly. No words, just presence, was enough to make the man freeze in place. Freddie attempted to defend himself. "Look, I didn't know she'd go to you." "I swear I—" Bumpy took one slow step closer. Freddie's voice died in his throat. Then Bumpy did something unexpected. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't yell. He simply placed a hand on Freddie's shoulder, leaned in, and said, "You made a mistake. Now you're gonna fix it." His tone wasn't loud, yet it carried through the entire block like thunder. And that's when Harlem knew something major had shifted. Freddie, the man who terrorized the weak, was now trembling like a child in front of the one man he never wanted to face. People would later say, the air changed that night. You could feel the fear leave the block. When Bumpy showed up, the whole neighborhood exhaled. This confrontation didn't just humble Freddie Marlowe. It restored balance. It reset the rules. It reminded Harlem who truly protected them. And the most shocking part, Bumpy hadn't even raised his hand yet. The entire block was certain that Bumpy Johnson was about to unleash violence. Freddie Marlowe had crossed a line that few survived, threatening an elderly woman who had nowhere else to turn. Bumpy had confronted men for far less. Harlem held its breath, expecting the kind of explosion that would be talked about for years. But that's not what happened. Instead of swinging a fist or giving the signal for his men to step in, Bumpy Johnson used something far more powerful than violence. His mind, his presence, and the weight of his reputation. Standing inches from Freddie, Bumpy kept his voice low, almost too low for the crowd to hear. but the tone carried authority that froze Freddie in place. "You're going to give her back every dollar you took." Today, Freddie nodded so fast it looked like he was shivering. Bumpy continued, "You're going to apologize to her, in person, and you're going to do it with respect." Freddie gulped and nodded again. Bumpy leaned in, speaking slowly. "And if you ever threaten another elder in this neighborhood, you won't get a conversation next time." There was no yelling, no threats of injury, no raised voice, just a quiet promise, and everyone knew what that meant. Bumpy then turned to his men. "Walk him over there." Junie Bird and Nat Pettigrew flanked Freddie, guiding him gently but firmly toward the elderly woman's building. It wasn't a drag or a shove. Bumpy didn't need theatrics. His presence alone made Freddie walk like a man heading to his own sentencing. The crowd followed at a distance, whispering, watching history unfold. When they reached the woman's apartment building, she was standing outside with a cup of tea in her hands, still shaken from earlier. Freddie saw her and looked down at the sidewalk like a scolded child. Bumpy motioned for him to speak. Freddie swallowed hard before forcing out a trembling apology. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I won't bother you again. I swear it." The woman stared at him, shocked, not because he apologized, but because he looked terrified. She had never seen fear in this man before. Bumpy wasn't done. "Give it back." Freddie reached into his pockets and pulled out every dollar he had taken, counting it out in front of her with shaking hands. He placed the money into her palm slowly, like he was handing over something radioactive. The crowd murmured. This wasn't just repayment. This was humiliation. Freddie Marlowe, the man who had bullied the weak for years, was giving money back under the watch of the entire neighborhood. The woman looked at Bumpy, her voice soft. Thank you so much." Bumpy nodded once. He didn't bask in praise. He didn't gloat. He didn't linger. He simply turned to Freddie and said, "You leave Harlem for a while. Let people breathe, Dov." Freddie agreed instantly, nodding like his life depended on it, which in many ways it did. And then, without a punch thrown, without a single act of violence, without even raising his voice, Bumpy ended the problem. Completely. The crowd watched in awe. They realized something powerful in that moment. Bumpy didn't need to use force. He didn't need brutality. He didn't need chaos. His presence alone was enough to restore order. And that's why Harlem respected him. Because sometimes the most dangerous man is the one who doesn't have to prove it. The confrontation ended quietly, but Harlem didn't stay quiet for long. Moments after Freddie Marlowe handed back the stolen money and backed away like a man who had just seen his own fate, the neighborhood transformed into a buzzing hive of conversation. Word of what happened traveled faster than any newspaper headline, faster than any police report. Harlem's grapevine was unmatched, and when Bumpy Johnson did something, people talked. The first whispers came from the group of children who had been sitting on the stoop across the street. Soon as Freddie disappeared around the corner, they ran off in different directions like messengers dispatched to carry news across the city. One kid sprinted toward the barber shop, another darted toward the corner store, and a third ran straight home to tell his father. "Bumpy made the loan. Shark apologize!" "He paid her back." "He didn't even hit him." That detail, the lack of violence, was what stunned people the most. Everyone expected chaos. Instead, they heard about restraint, power, and control. Within an hour, the story had spread to 125th Street. Within 2 hours, it reached uptown gatherings. By the end of the night, it had already been carried into back rooms, social clubs, bars, and even respectable dinner tables. New York's taxi drivers repeated it to their passengers. Bartenders repeated it to the late night crowd. Street vendors told the story between customers. And as each person retold it, the moment grew larger, almost mythic. Bumpy didn't even raise his voice. He stood there like a general. Hay protected her when nobody else would. Hay made the bully look like a little boy. Even people who had never liked Bumpy started reconsidering their opinions. Newspapers painted him as a dangerous criminal. Here was a story of him defending an elderly woman without asking for anything in return. In Harlem, that mattered. By midnight, the story had traveled far beyond the neighborhood. Folks downtown were already hearing about it. A taxi driver in Brooklyn told the tale with wide eyes. A musician in the Bronx heard it between sets. Someone even claimed that people in a midtown poker room were discussing it like breaking news. But what really carried the story wasn't the drama. It was the image of Bumpy standing with an elderly woman like she was his own family. Image stuck with people. It defined him more than any violent headline ever could. Unspoken messages rippled through the city. Bumpy protects his own. Harlem has a guardian. No predator is untouchable. And quickly, the story became bigger than Freddie Marlowe's humiliation. It became a symbol. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just feared, he was respected, because he brought justice when the system failed. The woman didn't just get her money back, she got her dignity back, and Harlem never forgot that. In the days that followed the confrontation, Harlem didn't simply move on. The story of Bumpy Johnson standing up for an elderly woman, calmly, intelligently, and without violence, became one of those moments that shaped how people viewed him for generations. This wasn't just another street incident. It wasn't another rumor added to the long list of tales about Bumpy. This one meant something deeper. For years, newspapers painted Bumpy as a menace, a criminal mastermind, a danger to society. But Harlem had always known a different side, one the outside world refused to acknowledge. And now they had a fresh example, one that couldn't be ignored. Bumpy Johnson protected the powerless when the system refused to. Older folks in the community began speaking his name with a new tone. Less fear, more gratitude. Shopkeepers nodded respectfully when he walked by. Mothers told their children, "You see that man. He doesn't let people hurt the weak." Even people who had previously avoided him found themselves offering smiles, nods, and quiet thanks. The elderly woman, once afraid to even step outside her home, started walking her block with confidence again. People would walk up to her and ask, "Is it true? Did he really make Freddie apologize?" And she would nod, still amazed by the memory, and simply say, "Yes, he did it without anger. He listened." Those words became a powerful part of the legend. Meanwhile, criminals who preyed on Harlem's vulnerable population suddenly went quiet. Freddie Marlowe's disappearance sent a clear message. If Bumpy could make him fold without lifting a finger, what would happen to anyone else who crossed that line? Street predators changed their routes. Con men shifted to other neighborhoods. Loan sharks backed off senior citizens. Harlem became safer because the police intervened, but because one man's reputation did the work the law wouldn't. That's the peace the city truly remembered. Bumpy didn't need brutality to control Harlem. He didn't need chaos or bloodshed. He didn't need to flaunt violence. His influence came from respect earned through action. To this day, historians and storytellers point to that incident as a turning point, a moment separating the myth from the man. It highlighted something powerful about Bumpy Johnson's legacy. He wasn't just the godfather of Harlem. He wasn't just a strategist or a street general. He wasn't just feared. He was trusted. Because when the system ignored the cries of the weak, Bumpy stepped in, not for profit, not for image, not for power, because he understood one thing: a community is only as strong as how it treats its most vulnerable. And that simple truth, proven in a quiet confrontation on a cold 1946 evening, cemented Bumpy Johnson's place not just in Harlem's history, but in its heart.